Welcome everybody, welcome to our regulars, welcome to people who are joining us, and a special welcome to Simon's mom, if I may put a shout out. We're in for a treat tonight. Two fascinating books that cover different elements of the Lake District history. One focusing on a specific parish, the other focusing on a specific activity which had a lot of its origins in the Lake District. If you've been reading them in advance, it's quite a read. Two books, 1,000 pages, I think, altogether, and we're so much better informed having done so. So welcome to our guests, Simon and to Philippa. So Philippa is a resident in Keswick, in the parish of Crosthwaite, of course, who's written, someone who has distinguished career in publishing, the first female president of the Publishers Association, born in Cartmel Priory Vicarage. Philippa now lives in Keswick in the same vicarage as Canon Rawnsley lived when he founded the National Trust, and that's something we might return to time willing later on. So welcome, Philippa, thank you. And then secondly, Simon, who many of you will know, of course, co-hosted the original Disparate Romantic series a year ago, Lancaster University, himself a mountaineer, himself an ascender of Mont Blanc. I don't know whether you is ascender a sort of reasonable word there. Simon's a trustee of the Wordsworth Trust and co-curator of our 2015 exhibition, Wordsworth, War and Waterloo. So welcome, Simon, too, and thank you. We're going to hear from Simon and Philippa at the beginning, both of them, before focusing on one book at a time. As usual, we've got objects to hand. We've got some lovely things to see tonight, illustrated in the books themselves, so you'll see some of the real things that are in the book. And I think there's a couple of things that Philippa's delighted to know that we have that emerged from the writing of her book. As Hannah said, please make comments in the chat as we go, and we'll do our best to pick them up. And we aim to conclude by 9 o'clock. And again, as Hannah said, we're recording the event, but it's only the faces on the screen, of course, that will be recorded. So just to begin with, I think it would be lovely if we could hear from each of you to read a passage from your book, one that particularly speaks to you. That would be lovely to hear your voices from the books themselves. So maybe, Philippa, if you'd be kind enough to go first.
Okay. I just thought it might be amusing to know Southey's instructions to his brother, who was about to start trying and writing a history book, of which, as you know, Southey was preeminent. Southey orchestrated his thoughts using his hard-won, systematic art of historical bookkeeping to annotate and re-annotate his exhaustively and exhaustingly collected encyclopedia of historical knowledge. First, he told his brother, take separate foolscap quarto books for each subject to be covered. Include one to describe the geography of the action. Read the longest book on the subject to establish a chronology, keeping a margin to detail sources after each paragraph, and only write on one page. Split the opposite page 2/3 to 1/3, the larger portion for you to amend or expand upon the original, and the smaller section for your own evolving thoughts. Read half a dozen books at once, so you never get tired of them, and cherish and record each small bit of color or surprising detail that engages you, and make up an index to retrieve them. And never rely on somebody else's footnote. Check yourself and see what strikes you.
So I know everybody watching just wishes me to ask, did you follow any of that yourself? Or...
Not a hope. No.
It's a wonderful system, though. And he was famous for his commonplace books, wasn't he? So
yes, that's right.
He had many of these. Yeah.
No, he was an extraordinary collector.
Yeah.
Of thought. Simon,
a passage from your book, if you would, please.
Sure, thanks very much, Jeff. So I thought I'd read the passage where I introduce the mountain Skiddaw, which obviously sits just above where Philippa is coming to us from tonight, and is a very important mountain, I think, in both our books, as well as in the lives of many people who are here tonight. As Thomas West's emphasis on prospect and view suggest, the motivation for travellers of taste to climb mountains was visual. In the Lake District, those seeking to gain such an astonishing view most frequently ascended lofty Skiddaw in the northern part of the region. Such ascents were described in a number of the most popular travel accounts, including those made by William Hutchinson in 1773, Adam Walker in 1791, Joseph Budworth in 1792, and Anne Radcliffe in 1794. Indeed, so central was the Skiddaw ascent to the picturesque tour that by the end of the 1790s, it was becoming a target for satire. In James Plumtree's comic parody of picturesque tourism, The Lakers of 1798, bad weather frustrates the heroine Veronica's plans to climb Skiddaw, but she comments, "I must go up whether it is fine or not. My tour would be absolutely incomplete without an account of a ride up Skiddaw." The mountain remained the most frequently climbed Lakeland peak and the high point of the English picturesque tour through the early decades of the 19th century. The artist William Green put a Skiddaw ascent at the top of the tourist to-do list in the Tourist New Guide to the Lakes of 1819, writing that, "At the season of the year when strangers visit Keswick, with the intention of witnessing the grand and beautiful scenes by which it is surrounded, a journey to the top of Skiddaw is generally undertaken on the first favourable day after their arrival."
That's great. And many of those names figure, don't they, in sort of as the chapters go through, you get to know those people really well. And we'll be looking at Mrs. Radcliffe, won't we?
We will, talking more about her later, and Hutchinson as well, I think.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, that's a wonderful start. So maybe if we turn our attention maybe to Philippa for the next half hour or so. So your book, which I'm going to hold up again because it's just a remarkable thing in itself, does seem to me like an amazing achievement. I learned such a lot from it, from the history, from the industry, from agriculture, social history, land ownership, museums, the economy, and then there's whole sub-stories. I mean, which I just found fascinating, the history of the churches in the 1830s, the sewage. If you want to know the story of the Lake Poets, you get the story of the Lake Poets within your book in itself. And what I love too is so many of the names that I read going through the book, I recognized from the collection. Just from the Brownriggs to the Speddings, to the Wilkinsons, and it was like you were bringing alive our collection, through the lives that you were giving with them, and whole things I just never knew about, the mass trespass that we'll come to later on, which I bet a lot of our viewers tonight aren't so aware of as well. I think you like Wordsworth. I get the impression you admire Wordsworth, and I think what I also want to thank you for is changing and opening my eyes about Robert Southey, because the first director at the Trust, Dr. Robert Wolfe, who I worked under for many years, I think didn't always have an admiring view of Robert Southey. And so I've rather followed that, if you like. But reading your book, it has completely opened my eyes to that. So I really did enjoy it, and I really did learn a lot. But a question to start with maybe is your motivations for writing it and the length of time. And when you started, did you know it was going to be 700 pages?
Well, a more reader-friendly way of saying that is 620 pages and 100 pages of endnotes. And no, I've got absolutely no idea of where the journey that I began would take me. I had two original motivations. One is I was always very proud of my Fell family, long association with Cumbrian land. And also moving in, as you say, to Rawnsley's vicarage. And those two things made me feel, in an unpleasantly overused phrase, that I wanted to give something back. So that was really what started me off. The vicarage was, of course, the hub of the old parish of Crossway. And I became absolutely fascinated by that in itself once I began to learn about it. It's extraordinary. It's 90 square miles. And if you were to start at the very top of Skiddaw and go down with Shrelkeld on your left and then up the tops again to the top of Helvellyn, down to Dunmail Raise, along Skye Head, up to the top of Great Gable, and then come back down Honister and Winlatter and cross Bassenthwaite Lake. That's what it encompasses, which is some pretty iconic stuff and a lot of land. And all land that I discovered so many things about. Like, for instance, I never knew, I expect many of you did, but I had no idea that all the land I've described was at the time of the Norman Domesday Book. It belonged to Strathclyde and Scotland. I just simply didn't know that. I should have probably, but I didn't. But it was when I began to learn more about customary tenants, the people who, the farmers and shepherds, inhabited and lived in the land. And when I began to realize that in Crossthwaite's 90 square miles, 18 customary tenants governed all of it from just before 1400 until past the middle of the 19th century. That began to seem to me very extraordinary. And then when I finally learned that both Southey and Wordsworth spent such energy trying both to promote and protect these people, I thought, I have a theme.
Well, that brings us to the sort of the history of the parish and Wordsworth's association, isn't it? That the Lake District was once a place of a pure commonwealth. So when he arrived in 1800, do you think he found that commonwealth? Was it there on his arrival, 1800?
Well, it was on his wife, on its way out. As you know, Wordsworth famously says that he felt that the pure commonwealth was in a dying fall from 1770 to 1820, when he considered there were no longer any remnants of it left. And 1770, of course, was the year of Wordsworth's birth. And at that moment, over 2/3 of all the land of Cumberland and Westmoreland was owned and farmed by customary tenants, farmers and shepherds, the native mountaineers, if Simon likes. And unless they behaved criminally, they could always pass their land on to their eldest son. And by this time, they could also sell it or lease it. If you think that that form of tenancy had been taken over completely, well, there wasn't that form of tenancy, but if you think that leasehold had taken over all of the rest of English land by the beginning of that century, it makes a very extraordinary difference to the life that they lived. A sense of future possibility and a different sense of connection. And it's very little, I think, talked about. And it seems to me a fundament, actually, of what Wordsworth's pure commonwealth is based on. Now, the hereditary rights had to be fought for both fiercely, constantly, and rather subtly over time. But when they were thoroughly established during the reign of Queen Elizabeth, something else emerged, that since the customary tenants, certainly in Crossthwaite Parish, but this is true of most of the Lake District, made up all the juries of the manor courts, that suddenly gave them, as a group, enormous power. And in an incredibly existential fight, actually, with James I at the beginning of the 17th century, the tenants learned the effect of acting together en bloc, and a brilliant fight from in Kendal saved them. So they only had to use that to work en bloc in the courts, and they actually had more power than the landlords, and over time could in some way affect how they behaved, which again is, you know, it's pretty unusual, that, I think. So when people come to be wonder, as they did, why Cumbrians are so independent-minded, well, of course they are. They've been arguing for their rights forever, and their essential ownership of their land, even in fact beginning to take mortgages on it from the end of the 17th century, was substantial. And that was then their glory days. And I just wanted to read the words of W.G. Collingwood, which I think describes it beautifully. He says, from the Restoration through the reign of the Georges, the customary tenants had become practically their own masters. They were forced to be careful, but they had no one to cringe to. The hill farming shepherd's life was, of course, based on a literal commonwealth, because the commons and the capacity to graze in it was the wealth of the sheep. And in Crosthwaite at this time, Crosthwaite Parish, there were no independent, no gentry at all in the parish. And this was partly because at the time of the fabled rise of the gentry, an arcane Norman forest law made it impossible for gentry to move in to any land over sort of sea level. And since uniquely in Cumberland, in Crosthwaite Parish, not only the vicar, but also the bishop and anyone under his authority were legally forbidden from any involvement in running the school, in choosing the schoolmaster, or having anything to do with the looking after of the funds that kept it going. You can say in Crosthwaite Parish that it is a literal truth that the 18 men, customary tenants, did run everything from before 1400 to 1850. And I think you could call that a mutually reinforcing autonomous community, which I would say is quite a good description of a pure common. I was just going to go on to after Wordsworth arrived, if that's okay. As I said, from 1770 to 1820, things began to happen that he thought ruined it. And it was before then, actually, in 1759, that the first thing that came in that was going to change matters, which is that the steward of the Percy land, and in the parish, that's to the west of Derwentwater, brought in enfranchisement. So the Newlands Valley was one of the very first places, if not the first, where it was offered, and the west side of Derwentwater. And originally, it just meant more land changed hands quite quickly. But very soon, strangers started to buy the land, people not connected to their parish. And almost always, those strangers would employ a tenant farmer on lease to work the land. It was so much easier to buy it because of the customary fines you had to pay and all complicated legal things of buying and selling were no longer there. So it was becoming reasonably easy, or would become reasonably easy, for quite large proprietors to buy up a series of customary tenancies and treat the people then simply as they were treated in the south, with no direct connection to their land. So that was quite a big change. And by 1831, enfranchisement was on offer in all of Crosthwaite Parish. Now, the effect of that, of course, was the new gentry moved in quite fast. So for the very first time, gentry from the far moved in to Crosthwaite Parish, and Derwentwater became entirely differently surrounded. Yeah. Perhaps they were commented, it's been suggested and makes sense to me. If I could just read the quote. Gilpin had written in a manuscript that was circulating widely at the time that a circuit round Derwentwater naturally suggests the visionary idea of improving it. If the whole lake belonged to one person, a nobler scene for improvement could not well be conceived. Well, if you were a bit pushy and you wanted to have an effect on people, I think that was probably quite attractive. And by the 1780s, almost all the land around Derwentwater was owned by Joseph Pocklington, of some considerable fame, and Lord Gordon, who became a great friend of Southey's. And a small bit was also owned by somebody who did have, he inherited from his uncle, who was a Keswickian, somebody called Ronald Stevenson. So that's two pretty big changes.
Well, you've got a wonderful line in your book where you said when these people were buying up the land, you said it was a good time to go shopping. In years, and I think it is, and we just maybe briefly just look at something that we've talked a bit about, which are the maps of the time, and on the screen, I hope you can see. Everybody a map of Keswick, of Derwentwater, and this one's done in 1784.
Okay, so what's so interesting there is it makes the essential point that at that moment, what was it? It was a parish. What do they choose? They choose the church and that wonderful view of the Skiddaw Range with the church standing out in front of it.
Yeah, very, very few buildings on there.
None, apart from the church.
Apart from the church. So if we move that, and then this map is from 1809, and immediately it can be seen that there are more buildings. So we've got, if you want to talk us through that.
If we can get round it. So Pocklington, who owned the land where the bound of stone was, Pocklington, and I think that's Greta Hall actually, isn't it? This one?
So this one, there's Greta Hall.
That's Greta Hall. So that's the only non-Pocklington building. And there's another Pocklington building over down the bottom and to the right. So it just shows, and I may say that by that time, Pocklington had left the area. But my God, when he was there, he did a lot. Of course, he had down there, that's what it is. He built the famous house, much despised by Wordsworth, who thought it far too dominating of nature, on the island, the famous island where they have these regattas. And it was by now, this date, it was owned by somebody called General Peachy, who became really quite an intimate friend of Southey's.
So there's Peachy's house, straight down there.
Yeah.
Pocklington's Island, Barrow House here, and all along the top here, Lord William Gordon's properties along the top there. So it does really show that contrast, doesn't it? Just visually looking at those two maps there. I'll just stop sharing the screen. So that sort of takes us up to the next sort of period, doesn't it? From 1815.
Yes.
Changes that might have happened in that next phase. And
so just to add to do with the gentry arriving, once Southey arrived to live with Coleridge, and after Coleridge had parked his family on the Southeys in 1807, Southey began to attract hordes of tourists himself. And certainly by the time he was poet laureate, loads of gentry and Oxford students were flooding into Keswick, which became, as a result, really, the Queen of the Lakes. It was the top tourist destination, which it stayed until the trains, which came first to the South Lakes, which then began to grow in importance. And as Southey held his famous bonfire celebration, which I do want to just read a word about, for the victory of Waterloo at the top of Skiddaw that Simon was talking about, the mountain seemed as free as before. And Southey proudly wrote, here we are, sorry. Never, I believe, has there been such an assemblage on such a spot. And then he provided an enthusiastic account of the proceedings. Some of our neighbours, some adventurous Lakers and Messrs. Rag, Tag and Bobtail, made up the rest of the assembly. We roasted beef and boiled plum puddings. Sun God Save the King around the most furious body of flaming tar barrels I ever saw, drank a huge amount of punch, fired cannon at every health with 3x3, and rolled blazing balls of tow and turpentine down the steep side of the mountain. The effect was grand beyond the imagination. Our bonfire fairly put out the moon. At the same time as that, actually, Skidder was becoming much less accessible. For that, in the same year, there'd been an enclosure of a particular manor, of which Latrig was part. And William Calvert, the rich school friend of Wordsworth's, who took him towards Salisbury Plain, and who also became a great friend of Southey's, owned it. Now, he had ideas of his own and thought he would plant a successful crop of oats at the summit, which, needless to say, did not flourish. But he made absolutely sure that the access remained, but other people who enclosed were not to be so generous. I could talk about the enormous difference between the South and the North and what was happening, but I think I won't. Just to say that, again, the customary tenants en bloc had some power, real power, about deciding whether or not an enclosure happened. But interestingly, for the poorer customary tenant, it was sometimes considered not a wise thing to do, because the legal costs, quite large extra costs of fencing or walling land, and the extra liming costs, perhaps were not actually worth it if it was just a distant bit of land on the common, not very close to your house. So quite often they took a bit of money instead. Southey was incredibly critical of what had happened to the yeoman, or what he described as the small farmer or yeoman, who had his roots in the soil outside the parish. Old tenants have been cut down with as little remorse, as little discrimination as old timber. And the moral scene is in consequence as lamentably injured as the landscape. And both Southey and Wordsworth plunged into vituperative public battle about the future of Britain after the end of the French wars, in which the two areas of disagreement were broadly about the benefit or not of the Industrial Revolution and the best ways of helping the poor. And land use became an absolutely central issue. And Southey and Wordsworth, believing that land was better for the poor, fought for state aid for small landholders, as well as for the landless. And Wordsworth, who'd just written his first version of anonymously of his history of the Lake District people, had explicitly earlier built his history around a class of men who are now almost entirely confined to the north of England. And they actually turned the Lake District into a casus belli. Ever since the 1780s and Tom Paine, there have been groups of people who wish to either give or lease cheaply land to the poor, so that society would essentially save money because they would be able to keep themselves and they'd be self-sustaining. By 1821, William Cobbett said, let's check, he would pronounce a return to small farms to be absolutely necessary to the restoration of anything like an English community. But of course, in real life, they'd long gone in the rest of it. So the only place that could be looked into, as people discuss that thought, is actually Cumberland and Westmoreland. So it made Southey and Wordsworth's portraits of them enormously important. And just to finish, in 1848, I think it was, when the most important philosopher of the day, John Stuart Mill, wrote his important principles of political economy, he found himself championing the cause of peasant proprietors and said it was entirely because of Wordsworth's work.
Well, that sort of brings me to one of the revelations, as it were, from your book was the Southey's Colloquies of 1829, and you have this in your book where you say really this is a book for our time as well, because
Yes.
talking about those on the margins of society and looking in it too. I noticed today there's a reference to people who farm animals purely for their meat and for their hide, and how that turns them. There's a kind of brutalism about that, which again we can think of with parallels today. So what did you say here? While hardly read today, they resonate with those whose youth coincided with the potentially revolutionary struggles of the 60s. First for Black civil rights in the States, and then again the Vietnam War. So it really, as you say, is a kind of book that we could turn to for today. We're sort of slightly short on time, but I just wondered if there's anything you wanted to add to that about the colloquies, because it was, as I said, it was a revelation to me.
I think they're incredibly interesting, and I will skip through to saying that Southey had always been particularly irritated by the idea of lake poets. He'd written just once about the Lake District, and that was pseudonymously.
That's volume 2.
Turn it rectangularly.
There we go. That way. So there's the church.
If you could see it, is actually a wonderful picture, that by Westall. It's worth putting your glasses on, it's so good. He changed his mind completely in the reaction of people to Wordsworth's poem, The Excursion, ridiculing Jeffrey's claim to have written a crushing review, retorting, "I despise his commendations and I defy his malice. He crushed The Excursion, telling me might as well try to crush Skidder." And from then on, he, out of fraternity and solidarity, was proud to call himself a lake poet. And there are various moves, including the poet describing the bonfire. But he fleshed this out most in the Colloquies, which he had conceived 12 years ago before he finally published them. In them, he'd written some brilliant essays about the poor in the Quarterly Review, which anticipate what in fact happened with the welfare state. And they became much more broadly understood at this time because he was the most important literary supporter, or was considered at the time to be the most important literary supporter of the Tories. And when Thomas Babington Macaulay, young and ambitious, wrote a 10,000-word review, absolutely spitting with venom about the Colloquies, it became a sort of set piece of the Whig-Tory battle. Today, because Southey believed that the Industrial Revolution had done more damage than good for the working class, but more importantly, because he believed it was the job of the state to deal with this by, for instance, providing universal education, for instance, having a new infrastructure so that he could create employment, whereas Macaulay would consider it as Southey's idol, the omniscient and impotent state should in fact confine itself to law and order and the exercise of economy. And I'm having to elide it, but sort of quickly, what Macaulay was full of a sense of patronage and superiority. And I think that he absolutely basically ignored, which is for me so interesting, and I I think this might even be a sort of new thought, is that at one level, the colloquies are simply a portrait of a place, Southey's parish. For instance, there were 30 pages on St. Kentigern and Crossway Church, so that his truth at one level can be judged by his accuracy. And I've ascertained the accuracy. I mean, he is accurate. Whereas Macaulay, with his ever upward future, was suggesting that in the future there will be cultivation rich as that of a flower garden, carried up to the very tops of Helvellyn. Well, we know Oates didn't even work on that trick. I mean, yeah. And essentially, I would quite strongly argue that they had a viscerally different reaction to the poor, and it was a necessary condition for Macaulay to make his argument about the future being so much better, to believe that there was consistent, universal, grinding agricultural poverty from time without end, with absolutely no exceptions. And the parish, for instance, has had a very good war, the French wars. I think he's unjust.
What it puts me in mind of too is Wordsworth's postscript to the Yarra Revisited volume of 1835, where he too is very concerned about the condition of the urban poor. So he has two men in the Lake District, Tories by nature, but very caring.
That's what's so interesting. And someone suggested that Southey's writing about Manchester anticipated Engels.
Yeah.
And who approved of Southey? Raymond Williams, and it was the left wing or the Marxists of the 20th century who admired what Southey was trying to do.
So we've got very little time. We've got about 3 minutes, Philippa. but we can't not just touch on the fact that you're in Rawnsley's house, how that was an inspiration for what you're doing, but also this mass trespass that we talked about. So if I could ask you to sort of briefly touch on it before we move on to Simon, that'd be all right.
Okay, yeah. Well, Rawnsley and his achievements for me provide a sort of glorious afterglow, lighting up and redeeming some old parish and indeed Wordsworth and Southey values as the tops of the mountains became free, not just for the people of the Lake District, but for everybody. And I'm not going to go into all the obvious things about the National Trust, but I would just like to remind people how important the mass trespass that he organized, or organized the society that organized, was. I mean, it's the biggest England's ever had. And what had happened was there was two-way pressure about mountains for about the last 40 years, that walkers were beginning to realize that enclosure meant you couldn't necessarily reach the mountain top. And landlords, who had always offered permissive rights to their land, began to realize that the trains, and particularly the weekend special passes, was beginning to damage it. And 3 landlords in the same year took action. I'll just stick with one, I think, which is the Speddings, who, after William Calvert's death, had bought the land, which they now owned, and they closed both the access paths to Skidder completely to everybody, and even planted conifers on either side of the paths to make sure that anyone got onto them, they wouldn't have a view. The Lake District Defence Society, which Rawnsley has started, were wonderful in making society realise that, the green lung argument for industrial age was good, but they weren't any good at this because they were basically upper middle class, and they sort of wandered around questions of access. Whereas Rawnsley, taking on from Wordsworth and what's his name, believed passionately in access for the masses, not just the elite. So he went local and started or restarted the Keswick Footbath Society. For a year, nothing happened. They sensibly offered to Spedding that why didn't they have access on one of the paths and he could keep the other. He said no. And there were various things, but it culminated on October the 1st, and the mass press was much publicised, much talked of Latrig, with these colossal defences all covered with tar, so everyone would get themselves. And because of this, partly because of anger, partly because of the publicity, North Cumbria came into its own. So hordes of people got off trains from Whitehaven, Workington, Maryport, and Cockermouth. Out they came. And by the time the threshold was passed, there were more than 2,000 people walking up the mountain, singing Rule Britannia, accompanied by a load of journalists. There's lots of things to describe about them, but what's splendid is they behaved impeccably. They staged the paths, everything. Everyone said how wonderfully they behaved. And then very quickly, just to stick with a character we've seen before, but it took some time, Spedding sued to Rawnsley and several other people to stop them ever trespassing again. It all took some time. And when it opened in Carlisle in July, 2 years later, the first thing they did was call 18 elderly parishioners. And one of them was Southey's son, clergyman's son, Cuthbert, and they all agreed that they'd use those paths throughout their lives. And Mary Calvert, who was married to Joshua Stanger, who's the great change we've had to miss in the Lake District, the family buggered up the customary tenants, said that she was absolutely sure that her father had intended to give one of the paths to the people. But unfortunately, due to his unfortunate habit of procrastination, he hadn't got around to it. I'll stop there.
So I think just to put it into perspective too, I think you said that the Kindersnout mass trespass was 500 people.
Exactly.
So this was quite a scale, wasn't it?
Yeah, 4 times as much.
Yeah. So we're still sticking roughly with our Skiddaw kind of theme, albeit is it the pup of Skiddaw that Latrig is known as. Thank you ever so much, Philippa. Obviously you won't go away. We'll come back to you before.
Okay, lovely.
But this is the moment, Simon, if I could ask you to return with your camera.
Okay.
Thank you. The reason I keep getting up, in case everybody wondering, is because I've got a table full of books and things, and I go off and see if I can find them. So it's not, I'm not absent. Well, Simon, we're going to move on to mountains and mountaineering, which obviously has an overlap with what we've been doing, and we're going to focus on this wonderful book of yours. Much like Philippa's, just learned so much from it. I wouldn't say this of Philippa's book, but I would say it, if anyone has this one, is to try and read it in one go, because it's kind of a fascinating. It's like going on your own mountain walk when you read it. In as much as what becomes novel on a walk sort of becomes the commonplace, which is one of the themes you pick up. That what was extraordinary early on becomes kind of the norm. How the landscape can become a spectacle, which I thought was fascinating. That with the cloud inversions and the weather had such an impact on your experience. How the experience that we have can be shaped on what we've read and what we've seen before, which I guess comes up with the repeated writings, doesn't it? The reprint things. How we may experience curiosity or fear. How the experience works on our imaginations. How walks can elevate our thoughts above the mundane, and how a walk might be good for us. And all these themes come out, and all these things are part of a walk as well. I'm trying to put a bit of an analogy here, but I just thought the book was a bit like an excursion in itself. And I love the way you do explore these themes. And from your perspective as a mountaineer and your perspective as a literary scholar, the two just, to my mind, really work so well together. And particularly, I love how you explore Coleridge's writing in the moment. You know, you can kind of, the point you make, isn't it, that he's feeling the ground under his feet and he's writing that experience. But then the other contrasting point you put in is about the climbing of Snowdon and your reference to the many literary references, as it were. And, you know, we even said, didn't we, well, did he even do it? Because it could be taken from other sources. So I thought those two things, I'm not saying, of course, he didn't do it, but just wonderful contrast between the two. So this conversation is long overdue. The book's been out over a year, I guess, by this point, and for obvious reasons. we haven't done it. But thank you. So maybe I could begin with that question that I asked Philippa, is about the time you've taken, your motivation for doing it, if you would.
Yeah, sure. Well, thanks very much, Jeff, for inviting me to participate in this session and to talk about the book. Romanticism and mountaineering have been, the two interests, I suppose, that have kind of defined my adult life. And people will know that there's a strong connection between the two of them. I guess it was probably reading Robert Macfarlane's book, Mountains of the Mind, which first made me think, actually, this is a serious academic subject. That's a great book, obviously, but it surprisingly doesn't have much to say about the Romantics. So it sort of gave me an in, really. So I started working on this at least 10 years ago. And I think, as with Philippa's, I mean, what came across, one of the many things that came across in Philippa's talk was obviously the tremendous enthusiasm and knowledge. And I think her book is a kind of labour of love, and my book has been a labour of love as well. It's been something, it's been such a pleasure to work on those two related themes of mountain and romantic writers.
And I think what I should have said, shouldn't I, at the beginning, really is it's about the walking experience and the impact on literature.
Yes. So the subtitle is The Literary Cultures of Climbing, 1770 to 1836. And really it's trying to do two things. One is to reconstruct an early history of mountaineering and to argue that mountaineering becomes a popular pursuit much earlier than is normally claimed, particularly in Britain. People normally associate mountaineering with the Victorian period. I argue that it's sort of fully established as a leisure pursuit by 1836, but also that it's enormously important for many of the writers of the time who are keen mountaineers themselves. Lots of them make the claim for themselves that they're mountaineers, and also that their writing was very important in the development of mountaineering. So in that list, we'd include obviously William and Dorothy Wordsworth, as well as Coleridge, who you've mentioned, but also John Keats, Anne Radcliffe, Lord Byron to a small degree, and Walter Scott. So there's quite a pantheon of writers who are engaged in this new pursuit.
And do I remember right that Coleridge called himself a mountaineer? Was that after his 1802 Scafell moment?
Yeah, he does. And he also compares himself to the chamois hunter, which is sort of version of the mountaineer. Wordsworth applies it to himself. Perhaps most surprisingly, John Keats, the so-called Cockney poet, refers to himself as having earned the title of mountaineer. So this is an identity that they're all very keen to claim for themselves.
So your book draws heavily on our watercolour collection. And I know that you put together a PowerPoint.
Yeah.
To sort of share some of those pictures.
Absolutely. It's always a pleasure to do things in the Jerwood Centre, whether sort of real or virtually. So I think what we're hoping to do over the next sort of, initially 15 minutes or so, but then perhaps, extend that by looking at some objects, is to look at some of the illustrations that you have in the Trust that I've used in the book, and to use those as a way into some of the key ideas. So I'm going to try and share my screen. Which hopefully I've done now.
That's good.
So, yeah. So I'm going to talk to you some images, and as I say, use those as an introduction. So this is the image that I used for the cover of the book, John Warwick Smith's view from Snowdon looking eastward. And this is the only image, I should say, that isn't actually from the Trust's collection. This one is from the National Museum of Wales. But there's a strong link to Wordsworth here, I like to think. And so there's a strong rationale for choosing it for the book, which I'll explain in just a second. More generally, the image captures two of the key themes of the book. The first of which is the power and the pleasure of the elevated view, as experienced by the three figures on the mountain, and also by us as viewers of the picture. In the Romantic period, the primary motivation, as is often stated, for climbing mountains was to get this view, which was often described as unprecedented, as astonishing, and as overwhelming. So climbing mountains enabled people to see the world in an entirely new way. So much of the book focuses on the language and the ideas that are associated with this extraordinary view. So I look at the way in which people talk about it as a bird's eye view, or as a cloud station in Wordsworth's case, or as a commanding eminence. There's interestingly a kind of politics to the mountaintop and a politics to the mountain view as well. So that's one of the book's big themes, which I think this painting shows nicely. Another is the sense of sociability that for me is captured by this painting. Romantic mountaineering is often presented as a solitary pursuit, but for the vast majority of those who did it in the period, who climbed mountains in the period, it was actually a highly sociable way of spending your time. You usually undertook it with family or friends, and in most cases with a guide. And people had a great time climbing mountains. Keats climbed Skiddaw and he doesn't quite get to the top. He says they went up Skiddaw with two others who were very good sort of fellows. So there's a kind of fellowship to this sense of mountain climbing, which perhaps links back to what Philippa was saying about the comradeship on Skiddaw. And I think if we look closely at this picture, you can see that it's portraying this sense of sociability with the two tourists. I take to be the two tourists who sort of rhapsodizing over the view there. And the guide, I think it's a guide on the right, who's carrying their provisions in a rucksack. And it's these figures who provide a lovely echo of William Wordsworth's Climb of Snowdon, which he undertook in 1791. And he did so in the company of his friend, Robert Jones, and also with a guide. And the guide had his dog with him, and this picture's even sort of magically captured the dog. So it almost feels as if what we've got here is a version, if you like, of Wordsworth's climb. Though of course we know that Wordsworth climbed Snowdon in the mist and at a different type of day, so it doesn't entirely fit. But Wordsworth, as people will know, makes the ascent of Snowdon the culmination of the prelude, his great epic masterpiece, his poem. So it seemed a fitting image for the cover. So we move now to some of the images in the Trusts collection that I've used in the book. And this next picture captures nicely for me what's a key part of the history of early mountaineering in the Lake District, which is the idea that climbing to elevated locations was actually part of the picturesque tour from its earlier stages. This is a drawing by William Green from 1804. It's titled Skiddaw, taken near Castle Crag. And what's interesting about the location Castle Crag is that this was one of Thomas West's famous stations in his Guide to the Lakes of 1778, which is perhaps the key early Lake District guide. As I'm sure people will know, in that guide, West identified the best places or stations from which to experience the sublime or the picturesque views that were available. I think actually maybe the seventh of these stations is the vicarage garden. So in effect, Philippa's back garden. But this station here, Castle Crag, is the fourth such station. Maybe quite surprising because it's 1,000 feet, quite a steep climb if people have done it. So climbing and elevation were part of the picturesque tour from its very start. And again, I just sort of love the sense of kind of fun that you get from this picture of these two figures who've clambered around on the rocks and have put themselves on the top of the crag there. So in the background of this drawing, you can see across Derwent Water to Skiddaw in the background, which became the primary target for those tourists who were seeking to climb a Lake District mountain in the Romantic period, as I mentioned in my introductory reading. So this is Paul Sandby's Keswick Lake from 1780, offering a tremendous depiction of this key Lake District mountain. Early in the Romantic period, William Hutchinson made an ascent of Skiddaw in 1773, which he described in An Excursion to the Lakes. And then Anne Radcliffe made an ascent on horseback in 1794, which she described in her Observations on a Tour to the Lakes. Really important account, that one from Radcliffe, which was forever being quoted. And I'm aware that Penny Bradshaw is in the audience, and she's produced a great edition of that that account, which I would direct you towards. For me, one of the remarkable things about this picture is the way in which Sandby makes Skiddaw look like a volcano, with the cloud playing the part of the volcanic smoke plume. Sandby did produce landscapes known as capriccios that combined features from different landscapes, such as one that mashed together Snowdon and Vesuvius. And I think there's a similar sort of mashing together of these elements here. And what this suggests or illustrates for me is the extent to which people's thinking about British mountains was in dialogue with their ideas about mountains elsewhere. The volcano Vesuvius on the Bay of Naples was a key location on the Grand Tour. And I think Sandby is here presenting Skiddaw as something comparable. Similarly, the way in which many people experienced the Lake District mountains was often informed by what they'd read about climbing in the Alps. So alpine climbing is sort of going on parallel to this. It's much more advanced, actually, than British mountaineering at the stage. And so, for example, when Hutchinson climbed Skiddaw, this mountain, he wrote about it as if he were undertaking a high altitude alpine climb. He writes, I quote, "The air was remarkably sharp and thin compared with that from which we passed in the valley, and respiration seemed to be performed with a kind of asthmatic oppression." So Sandby's painting and Hutchinson's account give great examples of how the Lake District mountains were experienced in relation to other renowned European peaks. Skiddaw remained the primary target for most Lake District mountain hunters in the Romantic period, but adventurous individuals started to make pioneering climbs of other peaks. This is John White Abbott's Hill Crag on Grasmere Lake of 1791, depicting Helm Crag. Of course, this is very close to where Jeff is sitting at the moment. This is painted in 1791, as I mentioned. It's not until the year after, 1792, that this striking but fairly modest peak was first climbed by someone from outside the area. At least that's the claim of Joseph Budworth, ex-soldier and travel writer, who claimed that he made the first ascent by a stranger in his book, A Fortnight's Rambles to the Lakes. And that's remarkably late in some ways, 1792, as a number of other writers from the period have comment. But it's notable that Budworth describes himself as scrambling onto the top of the summit rock formation known as the Howitzer, which is a spot that's so precipitous, it's the only Lake District summit that Wainwright didn't actually reach. So quite a feat of daring there from Budworth. Another area where Budworth claimed to have made a first ascent by a stranger, that's his term, was Langdale, where he scrambled up Piker Stickle on a return visit to the lakes in 1797. This is Thomas Allen, Stickletarn, Langdale Pikes. In his account of this adventure, Budworth presents himself as pioneering and daring. He's led by a local guide called Postlethwaite. It was an indication of how quickly climbing was developing during the Romantic period, that within a couple of decades, the Langdale Valley was starting to feature in tourist itineraries. In the Tourist New Guide of 1819, William Green described an excursion that he led of a mixed party, so men and women who ascended in Langdale. And he used the opportunity, particularly to encourage his women readers to explore the sublime region. The Pikes were also the location for some daring exploratory scrambles undertaken by the Smith sisters of Coniston, described with great admiration by Thomas Wilkinson in his Tours to the British Mountains, which is a volume of 1824. So just two more pictures I want to look at now. Obviously, one of the themes I explore in the book, as Jeff mentioned, is the role of the Lake District writers in the development of mountaineering, as well as the importance of the pursuit for their writing. And this is the scene of two of the period's great pieces of mountaineering literature. This is another work by Thomas Allen, showing England's highest peak, Scafell pikes from Stye Head. This is the location of Coleridge's 8-day circumcursion of the lakes in August 1802, during which he wrote the famous Scafell letter, in which he described his perilous and life-threatening descent from Scafell by the rock climb of Broad Stand. And this was also the location for the ascent of Scafell Pike by Dorothy Wordsworth in 1818, in the company of her friend Mary Barker, a guide, a porter, and a maid. Dorothy, of course, wrote a fantastic account of this ascent, which was incorporated into her brother's guide to the lakes in 1822. So for my final image, we return to Skiddaw and to this drawing of 1840. You can just see the date down there in the bottom corner, entitled On Skiddaw by E.C., possibly Elizabeth Cust. As mountaineering developed and became increasingly popular in the period, it also became increasingly gendered in terms of the modes of ascent used and which mountains men and women were sort of supposed to ascend, according to the guidebooks. Guidebooks increasingly recommended that women should ascend on horseback, as here, and mountains started to be demarcated as suitable for women or as a suitable test for manhood. For example, in his Companion to the Lakes of 1829, Edward Baines describes how he accompanied a family up Skiddaw with the women on horseback while the men walked alongside. The following day, he and his male companion left the women at their hotel and climbed Helvellyn via Striding Edge, motivated, Baines says, by the same emotions that drive men to fight duels, in other words, to prove their masculinity. However, many women defied such conventions, these growing conventions of mountaineering in the period. And in my book, I devote a chapter to the many women who were active climbers of the hills, to quote Dorothy Wordsworth's description of her friend Mary Barker, a group which included not only Wordsworth and Barker themselves, but also Ellen Wheaton and the intrepid sisters of Coniston. Indeed, one of my favourite passages of mountaineering literature from the period is Thomas Wilkinson's account of the Smith sisters climbing Helvellyn, the very mountain that Baines saw as a suitable test of his own manhood. And we might perhaps look at that passage a little bit later if we've got time. So I'm going to stop sharing now, Jeff. But I hope that's shown off the admirable collection of the Wordsworth Trust, and also introduce some of the key ideas and key figures in the history of mountaineering from the period.
It was fantastic. I mean, a fantastic, as it were, advertisement for the collection. And maybe this is a moment to say it to people, you know, particularly those who live locally, please come and see it. You know, where I'm sitting in the reading room, it's where we welcome people and the books as well. So if you want to come and see any of the things we've talked about, please do get in touch. Simon, one of the things I enjoyed in your book was the reference to the large parties. Because yes, you mentioned the Scafell Pike there, but that wasn't by any means alone, was it? Sometimes there were quite large parties of
well, absolutely. I mean, one of the most striking ones, again, very close to where you are, Ellen Wheaton, who's this fantastic diarist who writes accounts of her very impressive climbs, which includes a kind of solo climb of Snowdon. She describes this picnic held on the top of Fairfield, which is just, as you say, almost, I mean, it's not on the scale of the trespass, but it's a large gathering, a tremendous number of people there, but also, you know, great fun. Lots of food is consumed. You know, people again have a fantastic time, and there is this sense of it's a communal activity for most people. I mean, for most people, you know, there is an infrastructure for the climbing of mountains, which is quite sociable. For the most of the people who are doing this are obviously strangers to the area. They're arriving at an inn. They're then guided as part of a party by the guide who's associated with that particular inn. So in some ways, you know, the standard mountaineering of the period which is a word, of course, coined by Coleridge, or the first recorded uses by Coleridge. It's very different from the way we might think of Romantic period mountaineering. We might think of Wordsworth by himself, on the top of Snowdon. Of course, he doesn't climb Snowdon by himself, but he starts to present himself in that way. Or we might think of Caspar David Friedrich's famous painting of the Wanderer above the Sea of Mists, But actually, most people are there as often as part of these mixed parties, as I say, with others, and that's why having those three figures on the front of the book was so important for me.
Well, and yet, you'll remember when we talked with Kerry Andrews with her Wanderers book, we talked, I think, didn't we, about Miss Wheaton? Was she alone, almost coming down Snowdon, and the attention that she attracted from the men that she passed on the way? Yeah,
well, she's very interesting because she starts to ascend Snowdon and she wants to climb it by herself. And the guide is coming down with his previous client, with another client, and he just assumes that she must have missed him and not been able to find him. So he sort of says, hold on and I'll take you up. And she's already walking further away from him to try and avoid contact. And she pretends she can't hear them and just keeps walking because she wants to do it alone. But she's very conscious that as a woman alone on the mountain, she cuts a very unusual figure.
Yeah. Well, let's look at one of the female writers. Let's look at Anne Radcliffe. I'll just again switch to a camera so we can kind of see. Oh, this I just thought, Simon, might be nice just to touch on. This is this wonderful book by Westfield, again from Philippa's book. I learned a lot about the importance of Westfield's relationship with the Saudis, and this is just a delightful thing because this was published in 1820, and this particular copy, I'm not sure whether the camera can do this justice. Can you see the inscription at the top? It says, "To Miss Saudi from her friend William Westfield." So that's a William Westfield presentation copy to the Saudi family. And then underneath that is Ellen Water, and that's Saudi's granddaughter. So it's passed through the Saudi family before it's ended up in our collection. So that's a very wonderful thing to see.
That is fantastic, yeah.
You get that by a bonus, but this is this of course is the picture that we used for the website. So there's the Skiddaw in all its majesty by Westfield.
Looking tremendously alpine, isn't it? There, you can again see that sense of I think alpine peaks as informing that, and even informing the representation of the Alps themselves, the Alps in the sense of the pastures below the mountain. Beautiful, yeah.
So, Mr. Rogers, you talked, didn't you, about Skiddaw in almost alpine terms, as I remember.
Yes. She, I don't know if you've got a copy of it there, have you, Jeff? The Radcliffe?
I have. This is it.
Yeah, so I mean, as I say, I'm very conscious that Penny's in the audience and she knows much more about this than I do. So apologies, Penny. But the striking thing there is, as you can see from the title, actually, the Lake District element is sort of subsidiary. So it's a journey made in the summer of, I think that says 1794. It's a bit blurry. I hope 1794, through Holland and the western frontier of Germany, with return down the Rhine, to which are added observations during a tour of the lakes. Of Lancashire, Westmoreland and Cumberland. And the reason that the section on the lakes is added is that initially Radcliffe planned to write a travel book about Switzerland, and she headed towards Switzerland. And this, of course, was the time when the wars are going on, and she got to the border of Switzerland and wasn't able to cross into Switzerland, so she had to come back. So that's why we've got this focus on Holland and Germany, but not Switzerland. So interestingly, Radcliffe, the Gothic novelist, had already made her name writing about Swiss-style landscapes without having been to Switzerland. This was going to be her chance to go to Switzerland, see the landscapes. She couldn't do that. So she came back and went to the Lake District instead. And I certainly have a sense that the way in which she writes about the Lake District landscape is almost as a displaced Swiss landscape. You know, it's very much a landscape of the sublime, and it includes this great account of her horseback ride up Skiddaw, and the danger that has with it. And it reads, to my mind, very like her own fictional accounts of her heroines' adventures within the alpine landscapes. So yeah, going back to your question, Jeff, it does feel to me like a very alpine tour. And I think one of the things that perhaps explains its popularity, because it's repeated time and again in other publications, this version, is that it sort of gives access, it enables readers of the time to think that by going to the lakes, they can experience this alpine sublimity that's available there.
Well, this is the passage. I mean, we could focus a lot on this, but here we are. The guide conducted us by many curves along the heathy hills and hollows of the mountain, but the ascents were such that the horses panted in the slowest walk, and it was necessary to let them rest every 6 or 7 minutes. So, and then she goes on, doesn't she, at the bottom here, the streams, I don't know if you can see it, the streams are sublime.
Yeah.
It's a very, very kind of picturesque language.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah. What I've done in the book actually is to run a parallel of some of the descriptive terms she uses in this alongside the descriptive terms she uses in the Mysteries of Udolpho.
Well, that would be another example, maybe. A mile from the summit, the way was indeed dreadfully sublime, lay for nearly half a mile along the ledge of a precipice, and so on. So that's a very wonderful book. You mentioned Wordsworth. Well, here's the 3rd edition of Wordsworth, and this too is a lovely copy. So this is 1810, and I don't know whether that's readable. I hope it is, but it says from the ancient friend, the author. So it's a presentation copy from Wordsworth himself. So that's to think.
How fantastic! I haven't seen that copy before. That's
well, it's nice that we can surprise you, Simon.
Yes, yes.
But and it mentions to Miss Nangrave of her father, and then when you turn to later on in the book, there is a poem that mentions. So that's that. But I think what we were talking about with relation to this, wasn't it, was the meeting with the guide.
Yes.
The Postlethwaite.
Paul Postlethwaite, yeah.
Yes, Mr. Postlethwaite. And here's Mr. Postlethwaite, a bit like Dorothy does in her journal. She tries to represent exactly as the local person might speak. Now, I think you volunteered to read this.
Yes, I've got a transcription sort of nearby. I don't think I can attempt to do the dialect accent, but I'll try and read it out. So this is actually on the top of Piker Stickle, and Budworth has been escorted up there by Paul Postlethwaite, who's the son of one of the local farmers. He's 15 years old, and at this stage it's so rare for people. Well, Budworth claims that this is the first time anyone from outside the area has gone up this particular peak. So as a result of that, he's had difficulty finding someone to take him up. And eventually he's found the son of the farmer because the farmer was out and was busy. So just at the bottom of page 268, we've got sort of introduction to the two of them. And Budworth, who presents himself here as the Rambler, I think says, Paul Postlethwaite sat down by me and after answering my questions, thought he had a natural right to make his own. And then at the top of the page, we've got Paul's question. In the name of Fackins, he says, just let that come into focus, what has brought you here? The Rambler replies, curiosity, Paul. So that's Budworth's reply, curiosity. And then Paul says, I think you must be curious enough. I never come here but after runaway sheep, and I'm then so vexed at them, I could throw them down the pike. So a fantastic sense of the kind of the different perspectives there of the outsider, the rambler, the tourist who wants to climb the mountain, get to the peak, and then the local resident who only ever goes up there when the sheep have got stuck, and he's so furious at having to go up there, he'd like to to throw them down. And right in the middle, there's that lovely play on the word curiosity. So it's the Rambler's curiosity that has made him want to go to the top of the mountain. But then Paul Postlethwaite interprets this curiosity as sort of like strangeness or oddness, that you want to get to this particular peak. So it's a lovely exchange that captures both the sort of the tourist local dynamic in the period, but also the newness of mountain climbing in the 1790s.
And just by their very language, there is the class difference you can tell, can't you? So the military officer Budworth talking to the local man, very, very clear there. Simon, I'm conscious of time again, because time passes us quickly. It might just be interesting to look at just Dorothy Wordsworth finally, because again, one of the things I really enjoyed in your book was you're sort of chronicling Dorothy as she develops as a walker, from the time when she sort of stays at home a bit. I mean, we think of Dorothy as a walker, but more locally, maybe from her Dove Cottage years, and then almost by the 1820s, she's becoming increasingly confident in the mountains. I wonder if you could, we've got the letter here, which relates to the Scafell climb. So I wonder if you wouldn't mind just for a few minutes sort of talking about Dorothy as a longer walker and a greater climber.
So as you say, Dorothy's very much associated with walking, and lots of people have written brilliantly about Dorothy as a walker and as a daily walker. One of the things I did in the book was to go through all of Dorothy's letters and William's letters too, to see what she went up when she kind of walked vertically, as it were. And what I discovered was that there's a really fascinating evolution, where, as you say, initially she doesn't really go up the mountains with William or with John, her brother, or with Coleridge, or with any of the other people who are staying with them. She often begins by accompanying them on the start, and then she'll return home. And then you gradually, over the course of the next decade and a half, you see her starting to enjoy longer walks much, much more. There's a period where she's suffering from giddiness, which kind of limits her, but she's able to overcome that giddiness. And the culmination, or the high point, if you like, of course, is when she makes the ascent of Scafell Pike. But even after that, and I'll come back to this letter in just a moment, even after that, she continues to climb mountains, and she takes on this kind of guiding role and this organizational role. So there's some lovely letters from her in the late 1820s, where she's writing to friends and encouraging them to join her for mountain walks. And she even writes to Robert Jones, who's the figure with whom Wordsworth climbed Snowdon in 1791, asking him if he's happy for her to lead her, for her to take on the guiding role and lead him up one of the mountains. So it's a really great sort of narrative story behind Dorothy's evolution as a mountaineer. What we've got here, Jeff, I mean, you probably know more about this item than me, but as I understand it, is one of the copies that's been made of Dorothy's account of her ascent of Scafell Pike, which she made in August 1818. So she wrote an account originally as a letter to a family friend, William Johnson, if I recall. That letter is lost, but we've got two copies of it. One is the copy that's in the museum, which seems to have been Dorothy's own copy. And another is this copy here, known as the Kenyon copy, because it bears the parliamentary frank of Lord Kenyon. It's a bit of a mystery, isn't it? No one quite, I mean, Paul Westover has done some work on it recently, and I know you've worked with him on that, Jeff. And I think the suggestion is that this is that Johnson, the original recipient, may have shared or shown the letter to Kenyon and others, and then someone else will have made a copy of that version, possibly as a kind of practice in handwriting. But for me, what this really shows is the extent to which Dorothy, a lot of mountain accounts of the period actually were circulated in these handwritten forms, in these kind of manuscript forms. People would write them as letters. Those letters would be passed around, circulated, they would be copied, and they'd be read in that way. So this one, of course, eventually was published within William's Illustrated Views, is one of the versions of the guide. But many women's accounts of their climbs never made it outside beyond the manuscript stage. And I know you've got other manuscripts like those of Hannah Gurney, for example, and her tours, which talk about various travels, various climbs.
Yes, we do. And I guess thinking again of Dorothy, thinking about Tours of Scotland, for example, which were widely circulated and again widely copied out, and we have different versions of that. It is that they were more widely read than we might expect, certainly within the family circles and friend circles. Not everybody might know, but I guess most people would know that when it was published in Wordsworth's Guide in 1822, that this account of Scafell, the climbing of Scafell Pike, I should say, was published as if it was William who'd done it. He doesn't exactly say, but you're kind of given that impression. You're not told otherwise. But this is how it appeared in print, the thing that we have, as it were, in manuscript just behind. But it's beautiful writing. As you say, Simon, we don't know who did it, but it is, I think we did sort of link it to Dr. Andrew Bell, I think, and maybe was it someone who might have been a secretary to Andrew Bell and connected with Southey somehow that way as well. It was quite a complicated story that I don't think we could be 100% confident in, but it's just a beautiful thing and beautifully copied out. And I guess too, isn't it? We've got that link almost back to where we started, with Scafell writing Coleridge writing his letter of his Scafell experience to Sarah Hutchinson. So here we have, and am I right in thinking this was originally to Sarah Hutchinson? I think it was.
Yes, the Kenyan one. That's who it's addressed to. Yes, absolutely. I mean, I think one of the things Dorothy has been working on for a number of years before this is an ascent narrative. These become a very sort of popular subgenre in the period, and she is sent a couple of these. So Lady Beaumont sends an ascent narrative written by one of her sisters, where someone has climbed in the Alps in Montanvert. And I think Dorothy's very keen to produce her own version of that, which will be a counterpart, as you say, to Coleridge's Scafell letter.
So at this point, can we invite Philippa to rejoin us? Hannah, I haven't noticed if, we have two questions. Let me see. I may just read them out, and rather than try to paraphrase, let me have a look. So the first one's from Heidi. We may not have time for all of these. So this is Philippa. The Whig position on the poor has sometimes puzzled me when it's presented as the liberal approach, especially for the 1834 Poor Law Reform Act, and Wordsworth Tory positions presented as the conservative approach. But the Poor Law Reform introduced massive workhouses that were so devastating. It sounds from your presentation that this identification as Wordsworth as conservative, along with Southey, was problematic from the beginning. Can you explain how this position that championed the independence of the poor was seen as a conservative view at the time?
Well, I've always thought that the great danger is thinking that Whig and Tory is anything much to do with Labour and Conservative. The Whigs were the aristocratic party, and the Conservatives were sort of gent squires, if you like. I mean, I think it's misunderstood. And for instance, Southey saved the poorhouse of Keswick, which the state was going to take away, and he used his position on, he was involved in health there, to save it. And 20 people didn't have to go to this appalling poorhouse in Cockermouth, and at least had somewhere better to live.
So, thank you. Simon, I don't know, anything to add to that? All right.
I was reading the question on Friedrich, actually.
Let's move on. But if that's all right, Heidi, I was looking at the answer to another question as you were talking. So the next question is, this is Philippa. Would you agree that a good biography of Southey is long overdue? If not, which one would you recommend?
I think that I think it's such a good question. The last one that was written was by an extremely nice, very collegiate person called Bill Speck, who's recently died. And he admitted with these extraordinary collection of Southey letters, which is really a quite magnificent piece of research, accessible free from romantic collections, that he didn't think anyone should actually try and write another biography of Southey until that work was finished. And certainly a great deal of Southey's humanity for me has come through accessing those letters. And one or two people, including Wordsworth, actually thought that they showed the man better than anything else he did. So maybe it should wait. And I don't, in truth, think there's ever been a good biography, not a really good biography of Southey.
But yes, I was just had as it were, a senior moment on Bill's surname. That's what I was looking up. But I mean, he was a man who knew Southey. I mean, I think if people could get a copy of it, you wouldn't go far wrong with it. But as you say, but with the new letters, that's sort of a way to another bit of research, doesn't it?
And actually, I would suggest looking at the letters, which I think he's such a witty man. I mean, they're transformational, I think. So
they're if you don't know, they're available on the Romantic Circle's website, and that's just been a great contribution to our understanding. Interesting, when we looked at the Westall that we looked at that belonged to Southey, belonged to the granddaughter, there was another signature on there, which was Jack Symonds, and he wrote a 1945 biography of Southey.
Yes, he did, which I actually found very useful too.
Yeah. Simon, you've read the question addressed to you. Could I just invite you to answer it, if that'd be all right?
Yeah, is it worth me reading out in case other people haven't had a chance to access it?
Please do, yeah.
So it's from Claudia. So thanks very much, Claudia, for the question. And she says, I was actually going to refer to Friedrich's painting, Caspar David's Friedrich's painting, which is the Wanderer Above the Sea of Mist I mentioned. So thank you for that. But given that German romanticism is imbued with a certain sense of the finite and the tragic and the ominous, again, see Friedrich's The Chasseur, for example, would the aesthetic of ascent or elevation that you ascribe to some English romantics be in any way a counterposition of sorts? In other words, how English is this particular approach to mountainous landscapes? It's a fantastic question. I think in some ways it is quite English, partly because going back to what I was saying about Thomas West at the beginning, West makes this point that where the British mountains are different from the Alps is that you can actually get to the summits of most of them. So actually the possibility of reaching a summit is something that's much easier in England than it is in the Alps. So, this sense of summiting is a strong element. And I think you see that in Wordsworth. Of course, Wordsworth writes in Alpine terms as well, crossing the Alps, but his writing often continues to be aspirational. So you reach the summit and you continue. So thinking about the famous passage in the Prelude where he talks about still we had hopes that pointed to the clouds. Often there's that desire to keep climbing. For him, the imagination is something ever more about to be. So he's always reaching towards something which is harder to grasp. So it is a kind of infinite aesthetic rather than a finite aesthetic. I think also what you get in both the general literature I was talking about, but also in someone like Coleridge, is this tremendous sense of joy, the joy of ascent, the kind of pleasures of ascent. And again, it may be that the sort of climbing conditions make that much easier. But I would say also you see in Coleridge the kind of the doubleness of mountaineering, because for him as well, it is it becomes a sort of addiction, as we know. It's in some way preempts his opium addiction. It becomes something he's sort of almost compelled to do, but is a kind of a form of escape too. And at one point I think it's in one of his journals, in one of his notebooks, he talks about himself as the sort of wanting to be the mad shepherd who's lost his flock and is forever wandering around the peaks, very different from this more aspirational chamois hunter that I mentioned before. So it's quite a mixed aesthetic. I guess one of the things that's going on is that people use the activity of climbing and the location of the mountains to try out different kinds of aesthetic. So I hope that answers the question, Claudia. Well, it goes somewhere towards it.
Thank you, Simon. Thank you, Philippa. Just before we draw to a close, I think that's the questions answered. I just wondered if either of you had just a last thought or a last observation that you'd like to make. Not compulsory, but just when anything that might have occurred to you that you wish to.
I've got two things to say, if I may. One is, I think one of the masterpieces of Simon's writing in that book is illuminating. I mean, quite the opposite in a way of emotion recollected in tranquility. The way he covers the change in Wordsworth's view of climbing Snowdon and where he lands up and what he then sees it as being, I think is utterly fascinating. And the other thing I wanted to say was that in 1447 was when all the customary tenants lost all their power in Keswick, because the new gentry took over, petty sessions took over from the manor courts, and the power that they'd had for 450 years was wiped out. And there's been 200 years of talk about the demise of the statesmen, which is just silly. People, they didn't just go away. But I think what they did was they lost their self-confidence at some level, and they lost their power.
Okay. Yeah, well, perhaps I can return the very generous compliment Philippa has just paid to me. Thank you, Philippa. I mean, like you, Jeff, I love the stuff about the mass trespass, which was entirely new to me, and even in Philippa's account that came across, what came across was the importance for many people of being able to get into the mountains, and the pleasure it brings, and how valuable it is. Wordsworth in The Excursion, one of his characters says to one of his friends who's suffering from depression at the time, he tells him to climb every day. That's his advice, to get out and exercise every day. And I know that's not possible for everybody. If you're lucky enough to climb or to walk or to ascend, then that's great advice. But hopefully, even for those who aren't able to, then the figures Philippa has been talking about, or the writers that I've been talking about, will still enable us to kind of capture the pleasures that come from being in the mountains.
One of the poems you mentioned in your book, Simon, is Climbing Toil, isn't it? Where Wordsworth says, isn't it, about the heart? You don't have to climb mountains to feel that connection with nature, but as you say, if you do and you enjoy it, then, I mean, in a sense, we've got two sort of antidotes to the world in which we live. We've got Southey's colloquies we could read. We've got Wordsworth, Climb Every Day, as it were.
I wouldn't recommend reading Southey's colloquies, actually. I would recommend Southey.
Well, there we are. It's a thought. It's a thought. So just to round off, Simon, Hannah has put in the chat about our next two events, Catherine Towers and Jonathan Edwards, coming up. So do look into those if you would, please. Do get hold of these books if you can to read them. I've learned such a lot. I've enjoyed reading them so much. You can hear from the conversation we could have talked so much longer, and I'm sorry to both of you that we had to do it so short. But that hour and a half has just sort of really gone by very quickly. I think what it sort of brings home each time is if you like, the importance of the Lake District in the wider world.
Yeah.
And never mind the Crosthwaite parish, which is even smaller again, obviously, although large enough in itself. The fascinating thing you talked about, Philippa, with the independence, with the landowner system in this area being different, leading to, if you like, also Wordsworth and Coleridge and their admiration for the statesman, but also their concern for the economically less well off in the urban areas as well, and that these two men living in the Lake District very close together had this national influence. Again, it reminds us of that. And then thinking too of your book, Simon, and is it Leslie Stevens at the end who talks about the importance of mountaineering and the Romantics as the generators of that sport, and that too, a lot of that taking place in the Lake District, you know, particularly with Wordsworth and Coleridge and the residents of these parishes. So it can easily become a commonplace that this place and the people that we come to know have a great influence, but evenings like this really bring that back to us, and it does remind us of what a great influence this area and its people had. So thank you both very much. There's some really good comments in the chat, and well deserved, and I thank you both very much for the contribution this evening, and I've enjoyed it very much, so thank you. So we'll say good night.
Good night.
Good night, Philippa. I shall end. There's no easy way of doing this. We just have to press that red button.
Yeah.
Okay. Good night.
Night.